Welcome to International A-Level Psychology feedback from June 2024 exam series. We are now going to look at some questions from WPSO1, starting with question 1B. If you just want to pause the slides for a moment to find the question on the question paper and the mark scheme in the mark scheme. With this question, most candidates failed to gain any marks as they did not have any reference to the modelled refusal condition in their answer. Candidates should read the question carefully and ensure they are answering the question that is asked. Those answers that did refer to the modelled refusal condition most commonly gained 2 marks. It was a lack of detail that stopped these candidates gaining more marks. If you want to pause the slides and take a bit of time to use the mark scheme and mark this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This answer scored 0 marks. There is no specific reference to the modelled refusal question in the answer. The answer could have been written about Berger's base experiment, so it cannot gain any credit. Please read through this answer and allocate what mark you would give it. This answer scored 3 marks. There is clear reference to the modelled refusal condition in the first sentence, with reference to the Confederate who was a teacher. The candidate scores 1 mark for the first sentence about the original Confederate as the learner and the other one as a teacher, and the real participant as the teacher. A 2nd mark was given for the sentence about the Confederates saying they didn't think they could carry on at 75 volts. The 3rd mark was given for the last sentence about the experimenter encouraging the real participant to carry on. As can be seen, this answer clearly addresses the question and has 2 references to the modelled condition. Please read through this answer and allocate what mark you would give it. This answer scored 3 marks. There is clear reference to the modelled refusal condition in the first sentence, with reference to the Confederate who was a teacher. The candidate scores 1 mark for the first sentence about the original Confederate as the learner and the other one as a teacher and the real participant as the teacher. A 2nd mark was given for the sentence about Confederates saying they did not think that they could carry on at 75 volts. The 3rd mark was given for the last sentence about the experimenter encouraging the real participant to carry on. As can be seen, this answer clearly addresses the question and has 2 references to the modelled condition. We are now going to look at WPS01 question 6C. If you want to pause the slides and find the question in the question paper and the mark scheme for 6C in the mark scheme. Most candidates failed to score any marks for this question. This was mainly due to the candidates writing generic answers and not linking their answer back to details from the scenario. They need to include more than repetition of the name. In this case, there needed to be something about capacity of short-term memory or a mention of 20 common objects. Those candidates who did score marks often gained 1 mark as they failed to offer any further description. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This answer scored 0 marks. Whilst it does give an accurate description of deception, it is a generic answer, so according to the mark scheme it cannot gain any marks. There is no reference to any details from the scenario. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This answer scored 2 marks. There is clear reference to the scenario at the end of the sentence where it mentions it was a study about STM and the memory of common objects, so the candidate has applied their answer. It gained 1 mark for describing how deception could have been prevented through gaining informed consent, and a further mark for describing how this could be done through telling the participants that the study was about the STM and the recall of common objects. We are now going to look at WPSO1 question 10. If you want to find the question in the question paper and the answer in the mark scheme. This question saw a range of marks being given, with the majority being in level 2. Candidates needed to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of individual differences in terms of both personality and gender, and how these could affect obedience. The focus of the answers should have been on obedience, not conformity. There is an equal emphasis on AO1, which is knowledge and understanding, and AO3, which is judgment. As it is a to what extent question, the AO3 requires candidates to offer judgments about the extent to which personality and gender do or do not affect obedience. The better answers were able to show their knowledge and understanding, going beyond just naming personality theories, but saying how they increased or decreased obedience. They were also able to show their knowledge and understanding of how gender affects obedience, rather than just saying one gender is more obedient. The AO3 in the better answers was able to develop their arguments and offer some judgment about how personality or gender affects obedience. They went beyond just giving supporting or opposing evidence with little or no judgment. Please read through the answer on this slide and the next slide and decide what level you would give the AO1 and what level you would give the AO3. The AO1 gained level 1. The answer demonstrates isolated elements of knowledge and understanding. There is a bit of AO1 on the first page where they name the authoritarian personality and locus of control. The candidate shows no knowledge and understanding of how these may or may not affect obedience. The AO3 is level 2. There are some statements with some development of form, and it is mostly accurate and relevant. A judgment is presented. The rest of the first paragraph about Berger and Milgram researching locus of control is incorrect, as they did not study locus of control. The next paragraph about how there are theories which ignore the effect of individual differences and the use of Milgram's agency theory to elaborate on this is creditworthy as an AO3 point. However, there is no judgment about alternative theories and how much individual differences affect obedience. On page 2 there are further AO3 points, including the study by Sheridan and King, which gives a judgment at the end of the paragraph. The next paragraph offers social power theory as an alternative explanation of obedience, but again there is no judgment in relation to gender and the extent it affects obedience. Overall, this essay gained 4 marks. Please read through this answer on this slide and the next slide and decide what level you would give the AO1 and the AO3. The AO1 gained level 4. It is accurate and thorough. The first page is all AO1, as is the top of the second page. It addresses both gender and personality. The first bit on gender shows knowledge and understanding of how it may be due to stereotypes as well as empathy, and how women have higher levels of stress when obeying. Personality refers to the authoritarian personality, and again answers the question, showing knowledge and understanding of why those with an authoritarian personality may be more obedient. The answer then shows knowledge and understanding of how internal and external locus of control affects levels of obedience. The AO3 was level 3. The points were mostly developed with an awareness of competing arguments and judgments or decisions being present. The candidate used both Milgram and Berger in relation to gender and offers a judgment in whether they show gender does or does not affect obedience. There are AO3 points about personality through the use of Rotter and then Milgram and Elms, again with a judgment. Most but not all of the AO3 points are developed, but they are not well developed. Overall, this essay got 10 marks. We are now moving on to paper WPS02, question 1B. So if you would like to find the question in the question paper and the mark scheme for 1B. Most candidates failed to gain any marks for this question. This was often for one of two reasons. Either the answer had no specific reference to their chosen study and could have applied to several studies, so could not get the marks, or the answer was not a relevant improvement for their chosen study. Those that did gain a mark often only got the 1 mark for identifying an improvement. They did not justify or exemplify why this would be an improvement. Either just writing it would increase generalizability, reliability, or another relevant term, with no explanation about how or why. Others identified the improvement and then went on to describe a weakness of their chosen study, rather than focus their answer on why or how their suggestion would improve the study. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 0 marks. The first part of the answer is a weakness and so not relevant to the improvement. There is nothing specific about the study apart from the name at the start of the answer, which could have been copied from the start of the question. This answer could have been written about several other studies, for example Milgram, so it cannot gain any credit. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer got 2 marks. Whilst the study is not named, the facts that they wrote about students not just from Brazil indicate that they are writing about Hofelman. There is 1 mark for identifying that they could have used students from different parts of the world, not just Brazil. This is then justified as it makes it more representative of the population, so increases population validity. The candidate is writing about why being more representative is an improvement. We are now moving on to WPS02, question 2A. Those candidates who scored any marks often only scored 1 mark. Those who scored 0 marks often wrote an experimental hypothesis about a difference when the scenario clearly indicates that Herbert was looking for a relationship. The candidates who scored 1 mark often did not fully operationalise the quality of sleep through the use of the scale, or poor quality to excellent quality. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 1 mark for a partially operationalised hypothesis. The number of hours playing on a computer game is operationalised, but the quality of sleep is not. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer gained 2 marks for a fully operationalised hypothesis, as we have the number of hours spent playing computer games and the quality of sleep on a scale from 1 to 7. We are now moving on to WPS02, question 7B. Those who scored 0 marks often gave generic answers. They failed to apply their answer to details from the scenario, or they just repeated the name with no further application, as the name can be gained from the actual question. In this case, there would need to be some reference to playing games or children's stages of development, or different ethnic backgrounds, or the local school. Those who scored 1 or 2 marks could often identify a strength and/or a weakness, but they then failed to justify or exemplify why it was a strength or a weakness. Some just used the term, for example generalisable, but did not explain why it made it more or less generalisable. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. The strength gets 1 mark for identifying that it is proportional and so representative, with the use of children as the link to the scenario, so it can be taken as applied. There is no further justification or exemplification about how or why being proportional increases the generalisability. The weakness does not get any marks. Whilst it is a valid weakness of the stratified sampling technique, it is not applied to the scenario, so the answer is generic. Just using the name is not application. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. The strength got 2 marks. There is a clear link in the strength to children at different stages of development, so the answer has been applied and can now gain marks. It got 1 mark for identifying that it allows her to gain a more representative sample. The justification/exemplification mark comes through explaining that it allows her to generalise her findings to a wider population, and so this increases population validity. The weakness also gets 2 marks. Again, there is a clear link to the scenario, this time through the use of ethnic backgrounds. The weakness is identified through the fact that it may be time-consuming and difficult to carry out. This is then exemplified through the explanation about why it may be difficult and time-consuming, that she may not have the time or knowledge to correctly calculate the different ethnic backgrounds at the school, so it could lead to a waste of resources. We are now moving on to paper WPS03, question 7b. If you would like to find the question on the question paper and the mark scheme. This question required the candidates to focus on an ethical issue when using a psychological formulation, and this had to be applied. Those candidates who failed to gain any marks did not apply their answer to details from the scenario. In this case, they could have written something about the parole board reviewing her sentence, assaulting another woman, high rates of anxiety and depression, alcohol and substance abuse, or antisocial personality disorder. Those who did score the marks often gained 1 mark as they could identify an ethical issue, but then failed to justify or exemplify it. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 0 marks as it is a generic answer. There are no details from the scenario in the answer, as the use of the names on their own is not AO2 application. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 2 marks. There is a clear link at the end of the sentence that she suffers from depression and anxiety. There is 1 mark for identifying that Jasmine should have considered the fact that psychological harm such as distress should not have been caused. A 2nd mark is given for the exemplification when asking her about her beliefs and triggers, as she suffers from depression and anxiety. We are now looking at WPS03, question 9b or 15b. The question was the same for both options. The mark scheme is the same, it is just the details in the scenario that are different. Candidates who scored 0 marks either did not apply their answer to the scenario or changed the research method used by Annika. Changing the research method would not improve the study that she conducted, as she would now be doing a different study, so this is not a credit-worthy improvement. Those who did identify an improvement and only gained 1 mark often failed to justify or exemplify how or why this would improve the validity of Annika's study. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 0 marks. It is changing the purpose of the study. Annika is not investigating the difference between experienced and non-experienced jury members. She is investigating the characteristics of the defendant. As this suggestion is changing the purpose of the study, it is not an improvement of the study that has been carried out. Please read through this answer and give it a mark. This answer scored 2 marks. It is linked to the scenario through the use of the library and jury members. The improvement is identified as selecting her participants from different libraries. This is justified as it will make the sample more representative and so increase population validity. We are now looking at WPS03 question 16. This is a levels-based essay requiring candidates to show knowledge and understanding of problem-focusing and emotion-focusing strategies, as well as evaluate whether they are helpful in dealing with stress. Of those candidates who attempted this essay, the most common marks were in Level 2. This is either because there was an imbalance between the AO1 and the AO3, often with the AO1 being limited, and the candidates demonstrated limited knowledge and understanding of 2 strategies. Or it was because the AO1 was not accurate enough or in enough detail for Level 3, and the AO3 did not have arguments that were developed. The best answers were able to focus on both the AO1 and the AO3 in equal measures, and give accurate and thorough knowledge and understanding of both strategies, as well as having well-developed AO3 points. Please read through this answer and decide what level you would put the AO1 at and what level you would put the AO3 at. The AO1 is Level 1. It is limited. The candidate just writes that problem focusing focuses on the problem and emotion focusing focuses on the emotions. There is no further knowledge and understanding of what the strategies are or how they help deal with stress. The AO3 is Level 2. It is on the 2nd page and is more than limited but is not developed. The candidate writes that they are both useful and that the effectiveness can depend person to person. They also write they may not be useful on long-term issues. There is some development of these points, but they are not developed, they are brief. This essay got 3 marks. Please read through this answer and decide what level you would put the AO1 and the AO3 at. The AO1 is Level 3. There is accurate knowledge and understanding of both problem focusing and emotion focusing strategies in the first paragraph. The candidate has knowledge and understanding of how they both work and in what situations they can be used. The AO3 is Level 4 and is the rest of the essay. They have 4 clear points which are equally split between problem focusing and emotion focusing. The candidate has written well-developed points and has an awareness of competing arguments for both strategies, with conclusions being presented throughout the AO3. This essay got 7 marks. We are now moving on to paper WPSO4 question 3C if you want to find the question paper and the mark scheme. This question required candidates to identify 2 strengths of Amy using an interview and then justify or exemplify each strength. Candidates had to apply their answers to details from the scenario, which could have been through referring to the patients or an interview on CBT or the use of examples. Most candidates were able to score some marks, usually being able to identify at least 1 strength. However, they often failed to gain the AO3 mark for the strengths as they did not justify or exemplify why the identified strength was a strength. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. The first strength gained 1 mark as there is an identified strength, as they allow for her to gain rich, detailed data to help further understanding, and there is a link through interviews and CBT. There is no further justification or exemplification about why getting further understanding is a strength, so there are no further marks. The second strength does not get any marks as it is generic. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This is an example of how a strength can gain both marks. There is a link through the interviews and CBT together. The strength is identified as the participants will feel comfortable going into detail about CBT, so she will gain more insight into its effectiveness. The identification is taken from the beginning and the end of the answer. The candidate then justifies this in the middle of the answer, so can gain the AO3 mark. We are now looking at WPSO4 question 8A. This question required candidates to give 2 descriptive points, both of which had to be applied to details from the scenario. In this case, it could be parenting styles, infant attachment, or infant behaviours. Some candidates wrote about content analysis, which is focused on converting the data into numerical, quantitative data, rather than thematic analysis, which focuses on finding common themes rather than creating numerical data. Those who scored 1 mark often wrote about reading the articles, but failed to write about the comparisons to look for common themes. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This answer scored 1 mark. The candidate has clearly linked the answer through positive and negative parenting at the end of the answer. It was given 1 mark for describing how Lynn could read and find and record themes throughout. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This scored 2 marks. There is a clear link through the mention of the 9 articles and the attachment types. It gained 1 mark for reading the articles and creating themes that correlate to all of the articles. It gained the 2nd mark for rereading the articles to find common themes within the 9 articles through highlighting each category. We are now looking at WPSO4 question 9. Candidates had to explain 3 control issues in relation to the scenario for 6 marks, so there were 2 marks per control issue. The application could come through writing about using lines, testing conformity to the majority, the number of trials or confederates, how many times each experiment was repeated, 20 different slides, or the 3 possible answers per slide. Most candidates were able to gain some marks for identifying control issues and applying that to details from a scenario. However, very few candidates went on to exemplify or justify their answers. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This is an example of a control issue gaining 1 mark, as the candidate has identified that Poppy should conduct an eye test to ensure everyone has normal eyesight. There is no further justification or exemplification of this point. Whilst the first sentence about the confederates is not a control issue, that and the mention of giving incorrect responses has provided the application to the scenario, so enabling the candidate to get the mark for the point about the eye test. Please read through this answer and decide what mark you would give it. This is an example of a control issue gaining 2 marks. There is a clear link in the identification mark when writing about the slides. There is 1 mark for identifying that the display monitor is bright enough for everyone to see the slides. This is then exemplified and so gains the 2nd mark by if it is not, then the incorrect response may be because they cannot see the slide rather than conforming. We are now going to look at common mistakes and how to avoid them for WPSO1. The first common mistake was not justifying or exemplifying strengths and weaknesses. Once a strength or weakness has been identified, candidates should fully explain why it is a strength or a weakness. Do not just use a term, for example, generalizable or reliable, but explain how that identified strength or weakness makes it more or less generalizable or reliable, for example. A second common mistake is that AO3 points are not developed in extended response questions. Candidates need to fully explain their AO3 points in extended response answers and offer a judgment if the command word requires it. The levels-based marking criteria is on the website, and candidates can use this throughout their studies to see what they need to do to get the higher levels. Teachers could also use extended response answers from examiners' reports as a marking exercise with their learners, so that the learners can see what level of detail is needed to get the top level answers. A third common mistake for WPSO1 is not getting full marks on mathematical questions and not showing the working out. Candidates who get the incorrect answer in mathematical questions worth more than 1 mark often fail to gain any marks as they do not show their working out. This means that examiners cannot see what part of the mathematics they got correct and what part they got incorrect. Learners should be encouraged to show their working out. We are now going to look at common mistakes made in WPSO2 and how to avoid them. The first common mistake was that when answering a question about a strength or weakness about a named study, they do not include specific details of the study. When answering a question about a study, make sure there are details that are specific to that study in the answer. Reread the answer, or in class give it to someone else to read. If it could be said to be true about other studies, if only the name was changed, then details need to be added. The second common mistake was when writing hypotheses, not fully operationalising the two variables in the hypothesis. Use a highlighting pen or underline details from the scenario that identify the two variables and how they are measured in a correlation, and make sure to include this in the answer. The third common mistake was not including details from the scenario in answer to questions about research methods. Again, highlight details about the research in the given scenario and make sure some of these details are included in answers to stop the answer becoming generic. We are now going to look at common mistakes and how to avoid them for WPSO3. The first common mistake was not linking elements of the scenario to scenario-based questions. Candidates need to ensure that they include specific details from a scenario in an application question. It may help them to highlight details from the scenario to focus on what they are going to include in their answer. The second common mistake was suggesting an improvement that changes the methodology of the original study. Candidates should not change the research method of a study when asked for an improvement. For example, they should not suggest an interview when the study was an observation, as this is creating a new study, not improving the study that has been given. Similarly, candidates should not change the focus of the study, as this is a new study and not improving the study that was carried out. We are now going to look at common mistakes and how to avoid them for WPSO4. The first common mistake was not justifying or exemplifying when asked to explain. Teachers could use the taxonomy of command words in the specification to help their learners, as well as mark scheme instructions. Candidates need to make sure they do fully explain an answer when asked to do so, through justification of the point they have made or exemplification of the point. Second common mistake was giving generic answers when the question has to be applied. Candidates should be aware that if the question has to be applied, then they should include details from a given scenario. They can practice this throughout their course, as well as using a highlighter or a pen to highlight details from the scenario that they can include in their answer. They should be aware that just repeating a name from the scenario is not application. The third common mistake is not adding enough detail to 6-mark questions. Candidates often get the AO1 or AO2 marks on the 6-mark questions, but fail to gain further marks due to lack of detail when justifying or exemplifying those points. Just using a term is not enough to gain the AO3 mark. There needs to be some explanation. The use of answers from examiners' reports as marking exercises may help the candidates understand the level of detail needed to gain the AO3 marks, as well as demonstrating what does not gain credit. Thank you for taking part in this training.